My sister slid a basket of cold complimentary dinner rolls across the pristine white tablecloth. She told my 9-year-old son to fill up on bread, while her own children sliced into gold-leafed wagyu steaks that cost $180 a plate. When I looked to my parents for support, my father simply told me I should have packed a lunchable for my boy. My brother-in-law then threw a crumpled $20 bill at my chest and told me to take my kid to a drive-thru. I did not cry. I did not scream. I just smiled, squeezed my son's hand, and whispered a single word before standing up. What my family did not know was that I was not walking to the exit. I was walking to the restaurant manager's office to execute a financial slaughter they would never forget. The private dining room at Prime Cut Steakhouse in Buckhead was designed to intimidate. The walls were paneled in rich dark mahogany. The chandeliers dripped with heavy crystal, and the air smelled of aged leather and expensive charred beef. It was the kind of place where Atlanta's elite gathered to close corporate deals and flaunt their newly acquired wealth. Tonight, the room had been booked by my brother-in-law, Brad, to celebrate what he claimed was the impending initial public offering of his financial technology startup. Brad was a 36-year-old white man who wore tailored vests over rolled-up dress shirts, radiating the specific brand of unearned confidence common among tech founders. My parents, DeAndre and Brenda, treated him like a visiting deity. They hung on his every word, laughing loudly at his mediocre jokes and nodding enthusiastically whenever he used confusing corporate jargon they clearly did not understand. My sister Chloe sat beside him, dripping in designer logos. She was 2 years younger than me, but carried herself with the haughty arrogance of a monarch. Growing up, Chloe was the undeniable golden child of our household. She was loud, demanding, and constantly seeking the spotlight, traits my parents rewarded with endless financial bailouts and unearned praise. When she married Brad 5 years ago, my parents acted as if she had won the ultimate lottery. To them, Brad represented the pinnacle of success and proximity to a world they desperately wanted to be part of. Then there was me. I sat at the far end of the long table near the serving station, positioned exactly where my family felt I belonged. In their eyes, I was just Kendra, the 34-year-old single mother who worked a boring accounting job. They viewed my quiet nature as weakness, and my refusal to flaunt my income as proof of my poverty. They had spent years mocking me for not keeping a man, treating my incredible son, Jamal, as an afterthought, simply because he did not have a wealthy father in the picture. I never bothered to correct their assumptions about my career. They did not know that my boring accounting job was actually a position as a senior partner and managing director at Sterling Crest Capital, one of the most ruthless private equity firms on the East Coast. They did not know I managed a portfolio worth billions. I preferred to keep my life private and protect my peace. But tonight, their toxic behavior crossed a line from passive-aggressive disrespect to active cruelty aimed directly at my child. Jamal sat beside me wearing his best little suit. He had spent an hour brushing his hair and making sure his tie was straight because he was so excited to eat at a fancy restaurant with his grandparents. He was such a good boy, always polite, always observant, always trying his hardest to make me proud. He sat quietly while his 2 cousins, Chloe and Brad's children, ran around the private rooms screaming and hitting the expensive wood panels with their silverware. My parents thought their misbehavior was adorable. The heavy wooden doors of the private rooms swung open, and a team of professional waiters marched in carrying large porcelain plates covered with silver domes. The room fell silent as the head waiter began to distribute the main courses. The aroma of perfectly seared high-grade beef filled the air. The waiter lifted the domes in perfect synchronization, revealing 6 spectacular cuts of wagyu steak. Each steak was thick, glistening with rich juices, and delicately garnished with flakes of edible gold. It was an obnoxious display of wealth, exactly the kind of thing Brad loved to post on social media. A plate was set in front of my father. A plate was set in front of my mother. A plate went to Brad. A plate went to Chloe. And 2 plates were placed in front of Chloe's children, who immediately began mashing the expensive meat with their forks. The waiter then turned, bowed slightly, and walked out of the room. The doors closed behind him. Jamal looked at the empty space on the tablecloth in front of him. He glanced at me, his large brown eyes filled with polite confusion. He thought there had simply been a mistake or a delay in the kitchen. He folded his hands in his lap and waited patiently, swinging his feet slightly beneath his chair. I looked down the table at my sister. Chloe was already cutting into her meal, a smug smile playing on her lips. She caught me looking at her. She did not look embarrassed or apologetic. Instead, she reached across the table, picked up a woven basket filled with complimentary dinner rolls that had been sitting there since we arrived, and pushed it down the polished wood surface toward us. The basket slid and bumped against Jamal's water glass. "We did not order for your son," Chloe said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Wagyu steak is wasted on a kid's palate anyway. He would not even appreciate the marbling. Just let him fill up on the bread. It is free." The casual cruelty of her words hung in the air. She had deliberately instructed the restaurant to skip her own nephew just to prove a point about her perceived financial superiority. I felt a sudden dangerous heat rising in my chest. I looked at Jamal. My sweet, beautiful boy stared at the basket of cold bread and then looked down at his lap. He bit his lower lip, trying so hard to be brave, trying not to show them that his feelings were completely crushed. "Chloe," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. "What kind of game are you playing right now? You invited us to a family celebration dinner, and you deliberately excluded a 9-year-old child from the meal." My father, DeAndre, slammed his heavy crystal glass down on the table. The sound echoed sharply in the room. He pointed a stern finger at me from across the table. "Watch your tone with your sister Kendra. Brad rented out this entire VIP room to celebrate his company going public. It is his money, and he has the right to decide how it is spent. You are a single mom on a budget. You should have known better than to expect a free ride at a place like this. You should have packed Jamal a lunchable or fed him before you came." I stared at the man who was supposed to be my protector, the man who was supposed to be Jamal's grandfather. He was sitting there defending a white man who was starving his own black grandson just to stroke his ego. My mother, Brenda, immediately chimed in, eager to back up her husband and her favorite son-in-law. "Your father is right, Kendra. You always act so entitled. Brad is doing a wonderful thing for this family tonight, and you are sitting there acting like a spoiled brat because you cannot afford to feed your own child. You are an embarrassment to Brad's generosity. If you cannot afford to be in a place like this, you should have stayed home in your little apartment." The breath caught in my throat. The absolute betrayal radiating from my own parents was staggering. They were willing to watch my son sit with an empty plate while they gorged themselves on gold-leafed meat, simply because they wanted to maintain their proximity to Brad's perceived wealth. They worshipped the illusion of his success so much that they were willing to sacrifice their own flesh and blood at the altar of his ego. Brad leaned back in his leather chair, swirling his red wine with an expression of supreme satisfaction. He loved this. He loved watching my parents degrade me to protect him. He loved the power dynamic he had established over them. He reached into the pocket of his tailored vest, pulled out his money clip, and extracted a single $20 bill. He crumpled it into a ball and tossed it casually down the length of the table. The green paper bounced off a water pitcher and landed right next to Jamal's empty hands. "There you go, Kendra," Brad said with a condescending chuckle. "Why do you not take the kid out the back door and hit the McDonald's drive-thru down the street? Grab him a Happy Meal on me. You can leave the change as a tip for the valet." Chloe laughed loudly at her husband's joke. My parents joined in their laughter, blending into a sickening chorus of humiliation. They were laughing at us. They were laughing at a 9-year-old boy who was trying his hardest not to cry. I looked at the crumpled $20 bill sitting on the white linen. Then I looked at my family. In that specific fraction of a second, the remaining emotional ties I held for these people evaporated completely. The Kendra who craved her parents' approval died right there in that steakhouse chair. The sister who made excuses for Chloe's toxic behavior ceased to exist. All the hurt, the rejection, and the years of being treated like a second-class citizen transformed into something cold, heavy, and absolutely lethal. I was not just a mother defending her cub. I was a corporate executioner who dismantled companies for a living. I dealt with hostile takeovers, asset liquidations, and financial ruin on a daily basis. My family thought I was a weak, struggling accountant. They had no idea they were sitting in a room with a woman who held the power to eradicate their entire existence with a single phone call. I reached out and placed my hand over Jamal's trembling fingers. I squeezed gently, letting him know he was safe. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I did not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I looked directly into Brad's arrogant eyes and smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the kind of icy, terrifying smile that preceded a corporate massacre. "Noted," I said softly. I stood up from my chair and smoothed the front of my dress. I picked up my purse and pulled Jamal's chair back so he could stand. "Come on, baby," I said in a gentle voice. "We are going to take a little walk." "Where are you going?" My mother snapped, her mouth full of expensive beef. "Are you throwing another one of your temper tantrums?" I did not answer her. I turned my back on the table and walked toward the heavy wooden doors of the VIP room. I heard Chloe mutter something about how I always had to ruin a good time, followed by Brad's dismissive laughter. They assumed I was walking out of the restaurant in shame. They assumed I was fleeing the building to cry in my car and drive my son to a fast food window just as they had commanded. But as the doors closed behind me, muffling the sounds of their cruel celebration, I did not turn toward the glowing exit signs of the lobby. I took a sharp left down the carpeted hallway and walked directly toward the private administrative wing of the restaurant. My family did not know the details of my career. They did not know the reach of Sterling Crest Capital, and they certainly did not know that 6 months ago my private equity firm had aggressively acquired the regional hospitality group that operated this exact steakhouse. I was not just a rejected guest being bullied out of a dining room. I was quite literally the landlord and the ultimate boss of every single person working in this building. The heavy oak door of the administrative office clicked shut behind me, sealing out the ambient noise of the busy restaurant. The space was utilitarian, a stark contrast to the velvet and mahogany luxury of the dining areas out front. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, illuminating stacks of inventory invoices and reservation ledgers. Sitting behind a large metal desk was Mr. DuPont, the general manager of Prime Cut Steakhouse. He was a meticulous man who prided himself on catering to Atlanta's high society, always wearing a perfectly tailored suit and a crisp expression of professional detachment. When the door opened, he did not immediately look up, simply raising a hand to signal that he needed a moment to finish typing an email. I stood there in my modest navy dress, holding my son Jamal by the hand, and waited for him to acknowledge my presence. When Mr. DuPont finally lifted his eyes, his initial expression of mild annoyance completely vanished. The color drained from his face at a terrifying speed, leaving his skin the color of old parchment. He sprang up from his leather executive chair so quickly that his knees slammed against the desk, sending a stack of menus sliding onto the floor. "Ms. Williams," he stammered, his voice pitching up a full octave in sheer panic. "I am so incredibly sorry. We had absolutely no idea you were dining with us this evening. The corporate office did not send any notification of an executive visit. Please forgive the mess. Is everything all right? Can I get you something to drink?" I watched him scramble to straighten his tie, his hands shaking visibly. My family thought I was a struggling bookkeeper, making barely enough to keep the lights on in a cramped apartment. They had spent the last hour treating me like a charity case, who should be grateful just to breathe the same air as my supposedly wealthy brother-in-law Brad. What my parents and my sister Chloe completely failed to realize was that 6 months prior, Sterling Crest Capital, the private equity firm where I was a senior partner and managing director, had aggressively acquired the entire regional hospitality group that owned and operated this very restaurant. I did not just work in finance. I was the landlord, the ultimate decision-maker, and the apex predator of this establishment. I literally owned the chair Mr. DuPont was currently terrified to sit back down in. "Breathe, Mr. DuPont," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and calm. "This is not a formal corporate inspection. I was simply attending a personal family dinner in the VIP room." He swallowed hard, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket to dab at his forehead. "Of course, Ms. Williams, we are deeply honored to have you here. Please let me know how we can make your evening exceptional." "I need you to pull up the tab for the VIP room," I instructed him. "The party is under the name Brad Miller." Mr. DuPont hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting toward the glowing computer screen on his desk. "Right away, ma'am. Give me just one moment." He typed frantically into the point-of-sale system, his shoulders tense. As the account details populated on his monitor, a very strange expression crossed his face. He leaned closer to the screen, then looked back at me, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He looked incredibly uncomfortable, like a man caught between a rock and a very sharp blade. "Is there a problem with the bill?" I asked, stepping closer to his desk so I could look him directly in the eye. Mr. DuPont wiped another bead of sweat from his brow. "Well, Ms. Williams, it is actually quite an unusual situation. Mr. Miller requested to pay the bill in advance to secure the room and impress his guests. However, his primary pay method, which was a heavy metal corporate black card, was declined by our merchant system. He insisted it was a bank error and asked us to run it again. We tried it 4 separate times. It declined every single time due to insufficient funds." I felt a slow, cold smile begin to form on my lips. Brad, the arrogant tech bro who had just thrown a crumpled $20 bill at my chest and told me to take my son to a drive-thru, could not even afford the gold-leafed steaks he was using to humiliate us. "Go on," I said softly, encouraging the manager to continue. When the card failed the 4th time, Mr. DuPont explained, lowering his voice. As if sharing a dirty secret, Mr. Miller pulled me aside into the hallway. He was sweating profusely and asked if we could split the grand total across 6 different standard consumer credit cards. "We have been attempting to process those transactions in the back office for the past 45 minutes. Unfortunately, 2 of those secondary cards have already bounced because they are maxed out beyond their limits. He currently owes us $3,500, and we do not have a valid payment method on file to cover the balance." I was just about to go back to the VIP room to ask him how he intended to settle the account. I stared at the manager as the absolute pathetic reality of my brother-in-law washed over me. Brad was sitting in that opulent room, drinking expensive wine and acting like a billionaire titan of industry, while secretly begging the restaurant staff to run a handful of maxed-out credit cards, just to maintain his fragile illusion of wealth. My parents, DeAndre and Brenda, were practically worshipping a man who was literally bankrupting himself to buy their admiration. They had watched him starve his own 9-year-old black nephew to stroke his white savior complex, and the entire display was funded by toxic, unpayable debt. "Mr. DuPont," I said, reaching into my understated leather purse and retrieving my solid titanium corporate executive card, "I am going to pay this entire bill right now. $3,500 plus a mandatory 40% gratuity for the waitstaff who had to endure his arrogant behavior all evening." The manager looked deeply confused and profoundly relieved all at once. "You want to pay Mr. Miller's bill, Ms. Williams?" "Yes," I replied smoothly, handing him the heavy metal card. "But you are going to follow my next instructions exactly as I give them. Under no circumstances are you to tell Mr. Miller that this bill has been settled by me or anyone else. When he eventually asks for the check at the end of the night or tries to give you another maxed-out card, you will simply tell him that everything has been handled by management and wish him a pleasant evening. You will not explain further. Let him sweat. Let him spend the next week wondering if the restaurant comped the meal or if a glitch in the system saved him from public humiliation. Do you understand me?" "Perfectly, ma'am." Mr. DuPont nodded vigorously, taking my card and quickly processing the transaction. "Your secret is absolutely safe with me." The machine printed the receipt and I signed my name with a quick flourish, tearing off my copy and sliding it into my purse. "One more thing," I added, looking down at Jamal, who was still holding my hand, his eyes wide as he watched the exchange. "My son is hungry. The food in that VIP room was not fit for his consumption anyway. I want you to take us to the private chef's tasting room in the back. I want your executive chef to fire up the grill right now. He is to prepare your finest cut of meat exactly to my son's liking, along with whatever sides and desserts he desires." Mr. DuPont did not hesitate for a microsecond. "Right this way, Ms. Williams. It would be our absolute pleasure." 10 minutes later, Jamal and I were seated in a beautifully intimate dining alcove hidden deep within the restaurant, away from the noise and the toxic energy of my family. The executive chef himself came out to greet us, treating Jamal with the utmost respect and kindness, asking him exactly how he liked his food prepared. Shortly after, a spectacular meal arrived. Jamal ate a perfectly cooked steak, creamy mashed potatoes, and a decadent chocolate dessert. I sat across from him, sipping a glass of sparkling water and watching the joy return to his sweet face. As he ate, I thought about my family. I thought about how my mother and father had always looked down on me for being a single mother, working hard to provide for my child. I thought about how they had always placed Chloe on a pedestal, ignoring her terrible character simply because she married a man who projected an image of financial superiority. They had sold their loyalty to a fraud. They had abused my child to protect a liar. I was no longer operating as a wounded daughter seeking their validation. I was operating as a financial predator, analyzing a target. I opened my phone and logged into my secure corporate network. If Brad was bouncing multiple credit cards at a restaurant to pay for a single dinner, his financial technology startup was likely in severe distress. I ran a comprehensive background query on his company Paynova. The proprietary algorithms of Sterling Crest Capital scrubbed through public records, corporate filings, and shadow debt ledgers, populating the data on my screen in a matter of seconds. What I saw made me stop breathing for a moment. Brad was not just broke. He was drowning in a spectacular amount of toxic, fraudulent debt. The company was hemorrhaging cash on a daily basis. They were facing multiple silent lawsuits from unpaid vendors, and they were barely surviving on predatory venture loans with exorbitant interest rates. There was no initial public offering on the horizon. There was no grand success story. It was a massive house of cards, waiting for a single gust of wind to knock it completely into the dirt. Even worse, I saw a strange discrepancy in the initial round of seed funding from 3 years ago. There was a direct capital injection of $200,000 originating from a joint bank account that I recognized immediately. It was my parents' retirement account. DeAndre and Brenda had secretly given their entire life savings to Brad to fund this fraudulent company, and they had hidden it from me because they thought I was too poor and uneducated to understand high-level investments. They had mortgaged their future on a white con artist who was currently starving their grandson. I closed my phone and slipped it back into my purse. The trap was beautifully, perfectly set, and I knew exactly how I was going to spring it. They wanted to treat me like an ignorant peasant who did not belong at their table. I was going to show them what a queen could do when she decided to go to war. When Jamal finished his dessert, he wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and smiled at me. "That was the best dinner ever, Mom," he said, his eyes shining with genuine happiness. "Much better than that cold bread." I smiled back at him, reaching across the small table to gently stroke his cheek. "Only the best for you, my love," I told him. "You will never have to settle for crumbs ever again." We walked out the back entrance of the restaurant where my private driver was waiting with the car as we drove through the illuminated streets of Atlanta, heading toward our penthouse in Midtown. I felt a profound sense of calm wash over me. I tucked Jamal into his bed, making sure he was warm and comfortable, kissing his forehead before turning out the light. I walked into my expansive home office overlooking the glittering city skyline. I poured myself a small glass of bourbon, sat down in my ergonomic leather chair, and opened my primary work laptop. The glow of the screen illuminated the dark room. I pulled up the comprehensive financial portfolio of Paynova, mapping out every single creditor, every vendor, and every outstanding loan Brad had ever taken. I found the holding company that owned his largest, most aggressive debt note. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct number of one of my most ruthless acquisition managers. He answered on the second ring despite the late hour. "Darius," I said, keeping my voice smooth and devoid of any emotion. "I need you to initiate a hostile debt acquisition first thing tomorrow morning. The target is a fintech startup called Paynova. I want Sterling Crest Capital to buy up every single cent of their outstanding venture debt by the end of the week. Pay whatever premium is necessary to secure the paper. I want total control of their liabilities." "Understood, Ms. Williams." Darius replied, his voice entirely professional. "Consider it done. We will own their debt before Friday." I ended the call and took a slow sip of my bourbon, staring out at the city lights. Brad thought he had won tonight. He thought he had humiliated me in front of my family and proven his superiority. But he had no idea that by the time we all sat down for Thanksgiving dinner next week, I would literally own his entire existence. It was time to call in his debts and burn his illusions to the ground. 1 week had passed since the incident at the steakhouse. It was a crisp Thursday afternoon, marking the arrival of the Thanksgiving holiday. I pulled my modest-looking sedan into the long concrete driveway of my parents' spacious house in the Atlanta suburbs. The driveway was already crowded with cars, including the gleaming white Mercedes-Benz that Brad had recently purchased for my sister Chloe. I parked on the street, carefully gathering my thoughts before stepping out of the vehicle. Jamal sat in the passenger seat holding a small baked pie we had brought as a contribution to the dinner. He looked up at me with hesitant eyes, clearly remembering the humiliation he had endured just 7 days prior. I unbuckled his seatbelt and pulled him into a tight embrace, smoothing down his shirt and telling him that today would be different. I promised him that no one would ever disrespect him again. We walked up the brick pathway to the front door, and the rich, heavy scents of roasted turkey, baked macaroni and cheese, and collard greens drifted out to greet us. It was the smell of my childhood, but the warmth it should have provided was entirely absent. I pushed the front door open and we stepped into the bustling entryway. The house was loud, filled with the sounds of a televised football game and the booming laughter of my father, DeAndre. My mother, Brenda, emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a decorative apron. When she saw Jamal and me standing in the foyer, the welcoming smile she wore instantly dissolved into a thin line of mild irritation. She did not offer a hug or a warm greeting. She simply looked me up and down, taking in my casual attire. I was wearing a simple cashmere sweater and tailored trousers, a quiet luxury brand that cost more than her entire living room furniture set. But to her untrained eye, I just looked like a struggling single mother who could not afford to dress up for a holiday. She snatched the pie from Jamal's hands without thanking him and muttered that we were late, even though we had arrived exactly at the requested time. I led Jamal into the living room, where the rest of the family was holding court. Chloe was perched elegantly on the center of the plush leather sofa, looking like she had just stepped out of a luxury magazine. She wore a vibrant silk dress, and wrapped around her neck was a brand new thick gold Cartier necklace that caught the light every time she moved. She was showing it off to my aunts and cousins, making sure everyone knew exactly how much it cost and exactly who had bought it for her. Brad stood near the fireplace holding a crystal glass filled with expensive bourbon. He was holding the entire room captive with his loud, booming voice, dictating the terms of his supposed corporate success. He told my father and my uncles about his financial technology startup, Paynova. He bragged about the upcoming initial public offering, claiming it would make him a multimillionaire before the end of the fiscal year. My father, DeAndre, nodded along vigorously, hanging on every single word Brad spoke. My father treated Brad like a visiting king, elevating this white man above everyone else in the room, simply because he projected an aura of infinite wealth. DeAndre had always worshipped money and proximity to power, and Brad offered him the ultimate illusion of both. I guided Jamal to a quiet corner seat far away from the center of attention. We sat down together and I handed him his tablet so he could play a game and ignore the toxic environment. I sat silently observing the people who were supposed to be my family. I knew the truth about Brad. I knew that his company was bleeding cash and surviving on predatory venture debt. I knew that the Cartier necklace around my sister's neck was paid for with stolen money. But I kept my face perfectly neutral, letting them enjoy the final moments of their fabricated reality. Brenda walked into the living room carrying a large silver tray of appetizers. She set it down on the coffee table right in front of Brad, offering him the first piece before anyone else could eat. She then turned her attention to me, her eyes narrowing as she found a new target for her bitterness. She sighed loudly, making sure the entire room was listening before she began to speak. She pointed at Chloe and told everyone to look at how beautiful and happy her youngest daughter was. She said Chloe was the perfect example of a woman who knew her worth and knew how to build a perfect marriage. Then Brenda looked directly at me and compared Chloe's sparkling life to my failed existence. She told the room it was a profound shame that I had never learned how to keep a man happy. She said my life was a cautionary tale for any woman who prioritized a boring desk job over taking care of her husband. Her words dragged my painful past into the center of the holiday gathering. 5 years ago, my ex-husband had walked out on me and Jamal, leaving us to fend for ourselves. Instead of supporting me through the devastating heartbreak, my parents had blamed me entirely for the divorce. They told me I worked too many hours and did not cater to his needs. They said a woman should always know her place and that Chloe understood how to properly treat a provider. Brenda stood there rewriting history to make me the villain of my own life, just to elevate Chloe and Brad to an even higher pedestal. She called me a stubborn, independent woman, as if it were a disease. Jamal shifted uncomfortably beside me, his small shoulders tensing as he heard his grandmother tear me down. I placed a reassuring hand on his knee and whispered that it was all right. I told him to go sit in the den where my younger cousins were watching a movie so he would not have to listen to another word. Once Jamal was safely out of the room, Chloe turned her full attention to me. She excused herself from the sofa and gestured for me to follow her into the kitchen. I stood up and walked down the hallway, entering the brightly lit kitchen where the catering staff usually set up the food. Chloe followed close behind me, her designer heels clicking sharply against the ceramic tile. As soon as the door swung shut, she crossed her arms over her chest and blocked the exit. Her face twisted into an ugly sneer. She dropped her voice to a harsh whisper and began to shame me for what she thought had happened at the restaurant a week ago. She said she could not believe I was pathetic enough to pull a dime and dash at a luxury establishment. She told me I was a coward for running away crying just because Brad made a simple joke about buying Jamal a happy meal. She claimed my dramatic exit had humiliated the entire family in front of the restaurant staff. Chloe stepped closer, invading my personal space and pointing a manicured finger at my chest. She told me that Brad had to cover my massive bill because I was too broke and too sensitive to handle a real adult dinner. She said the bill was $3,500 and that Brad generously paid it out of his own pocket to save the family from public embarrassment. She demanded that I walk back into the living room right that very second and apologize to him in front of all our relatives. She said I owed him my gratitude and that I needed to stop acting like a jealous, bitter woman. I took a slow, deep breath and stared at my sister. I did not flinch or back away. I just looked at her, analyzing the absolute absurdity of her confidence. She was so remarkably certain in her ignorance. She was standing there wearing jewelry bought with fraudulent funds, lecturing me about a restaurant bill that I had actually paid myself with my own corporate card. The sheer audacity of her delusion was almost beautiful to witness. She had no idea that she was speaking to the senior partner of the private equity firm that literally owned the restaurant she was bragging about. Before I could even formulate a response, the kitchen door swung open and Brad walked in. He was puffing out his chest and swirling the amber liquid in his crystal Scotch glass. He stood right next to Chloe, placing a highly possessive hand on her waist, and looked at me with an expression of overwhelming, patronizing pity. He was ready to play the role of the magnanimous white savior to absolute perfection. Brad told Chloe not to be too hard on me. He said he completely understood that accounting clerks do not make much money, and that a high-end place like Prime Cut was incredibly intimidating for someone in my low tax bracket. He said it was natural for me to panic when I saw the prices on the menu. He smiled a sickeningly sweet smile, showing off his perfectly white teeth, and told me he was willing to forgive the $3,500 debt. He said I did not have to pay him back a single dime as long as I admitted I was wrong and promised never to embarrass his wife in public ever again. He said family looks out for family, even the ones who struggle to keep up. I looked at the two of them standing there, bathed in the false, radiant light of their fabricated wealth. They were completely convinced they had backed me into a corner. They thought they had successfully asserted their dominance and forced me to bend the knee to their financial superiority. I did not argue with them. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I did not let any anger show on my face. I simply maintained my calm, icy composure and reached my hand deep into my designer purse. My fingers brushed against the crisp folded paper inside the silk lining of my designer bag. I did not pull it out right away. I let my hand rest there, feeling the sharp edges of the receipt that held the power to destroy the entire fictional universe my sister and her husband had built. Brad was still standing near the kitchen island, swirling his expensive bourbon, looking down at me with that pathetic savior complex painted all over his face. Chloe was leaning against the counter, crossing her arms and waiting for me to break down and cry. They were so confident in my defeat. I slowly withdrew my hand from the purse, keeping the folded piece of paper hidden securely in my palm. I looked at Brad and told him that if we were going to discuss apologies and unpaid debts, we needed to do it in the living room in front of the entire family. I told him that a grand gesture like his deserved a proper audience. Chloe smiled triumphantly, thinking I had finally surrendered to her perceived superiority. She immediately agreed, saying that the whole family needed to hear me take responsibility for embarrassing them at the luxury steakhouse. Brad puffed out his chest even further, nodding in arrogant agreement. He gestured toward the swinging kitchen door, allowing me to walk out first, like he was a gracious king guiding a peasant. I pushed through the heavy wooden door and stepped back into the sprawling living room. My son Jamal was safely tucked away in the back den watching movies with the younger cousins far removed from the incoming blast radius. The living room was loud and chaotic. The televised football game was blaring on the large flat-screen television, and my aunts and uncles were passing around bowls of roasted pecans, complaining about the holiday traffic they had fought to get here. The smell of cinnamon-baked apples and roasted turkey hung thick in the warm air. My mother Brenda was arranging a massive floral centerpiece on the main dining table, instructing my teenage cousins on exactly where to place the polished silver cutlery. When she saw me walk in, followed closely by a beaming Chloe and a swaggering Brad, she immediately stopped what she was doing. She clapped her hands together loudly, calling for everyone to be quiet. The room gradually settled down as family members turned their heads toward us, anticipating drama. My father DeAndre stood up from his leather recliner and muted the television. He looked at Brad with total adoration before turning his gaze to me. His expression hardened as he prepared to witness my submission. Brad stepped forward, positioning himself right in the center of the room. He cleared his throat and put on his best performance for the crowd. He told the extended family that there had been a small, unfortunate misunderstanding at the restaurant last week, and that I was feeling overwhelmed by the luxury of the environment. He announced to my aunts and uncles that my bill had come to $3,500 and that I had panicked because accounting clerks do not make that kind of money. He lied with such ease, saying he had generously covered the tab to protect the family name from embarrassment. He looked around the room and stated that he was willing to forgive my massive debt entirely because the holidays are about grace and second chances. My mother swooned, placing a hand over her heart and telling everyone how incredibly blessed they were to have a son-in-law like Brad. She looked at me and demanded that I thank him for his charity. She said I needed to show some respect for the white man who was elevating our family status and providing us with access to a better life. My father nodded sternly, telling me to go ahead and speak my apology so we could finally eat dinner. I walked slowly toward the center of the large dining table. Every single eye in the room was fixed on me. They were waiting for me to lower my head and whisper a pathetic apology. They were waiting for me to validate their toxic hierarchy. I stopped right in front of where my father was standing. I looked down at the polished wood of the holiday table. I uncurled my fingers and placed the folded piece of paper onto the surface. I smoothed it out carefully with the palm of my hand, making sure the bold black ink was perfectly visible under the bright dining room chandelier. I pushed the paper across the table until it rested exactly in front of my father. "Take a look at that, Dad," I said, my voice ringing crystal clear in the silent room. My father frowned, looking down at the small rectangular slip of paper. It was the itemized merchant receipt from Prime Cut Steakhouse. At the very top, it listed the total amount of $3,500. But it was the information printed directly below the total that made my father freeze. His eyes widened as he read the bold text confirming that the balance had been paid in full. He read the name of the cardholder printed clearly on the receipt, Kendra Williams. And right beneath my name was the corporate billing account title reading Sterling Crest Capital. My father looked up from the receipt, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. He looked at me, then back down at the paper. "Kendra, what is this?" he asked, his voice losing its authoritative edge. "What does this mean?" I turned my attention away from my father and locked eyes with Brad. The smug, satisfied smirk had not completely left his face yet because he did not know what was written on the paper. "You covered the bill?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. That is truly fascinating, Brad. Because when I walked into the general manager private office, he told me a very different story. He told me that your heavy metal corporate card declined. He told me it declined 4 separate times due to insufficient funds. The air in the room seemed to vanish completely. Chloe stopped breathing. Brad's face began to lose its color, draining away, until he looked sickly and pale. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, lethal precision of a woman who held absolutely all the cards. I continued telling the entire room exactly what had happened. I explained how Brad had pulled the manager into the hallway, sweating and begging to split the massive bill across 6 different standard consumer credit cards. I told my family how 2 of those secondary cards had bounced immediately because they were maxed out beyond their limits. I watched the horror wash over my aunts and uncles as they realized the wealthy tech founder they had been worshipping was secretly begging restaurant staff to run empty credit cards just to maintain a fake image. I paid the bill, Brad, I said, stepping closer to him. I paid the $3,500 in full before you even had the chance to ask the waiter for the dessert menu. You did not save me. You did not protect the family name. You sat in that room pretending to be a billionaire while secretly hoping a glitch in the merchant system would save you from public humiliation. For a moment, the silence in the living room was absolute. Then the blind panic set in. Brad stepped back, his eyes darting frantically around the room as he realized his entire facade was crumbling in real time. But instead of admitting the truth, he leaned heavily into his narcissism. He pointed a trembling finger at me and raised his voice, trying to drown out the facts with sheer volume. "That is a lie!" he shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "The machine at the restaurant was broken. It was a network error with the bank. My card has no limit. She is making this all up to steal my glory." Chloe immediately jumped to her husband's defense. She rushed over to the table and snatched the receipt out of my father's hands, holding it up as if it were a contagious disease. "She is faking it," she screamed, looking wildly at my parents. "She printed a fake receipt to make Brad look bad. She is just a jealous, spiteful woman who cannot stand to see me happy. She probably used some free software online to type this up just to ruin our Thanksgiving." My mother Brenda did not hesitate for a single second. She blindly sided with the man who provided her with an illusion of high society. She marched over to me, her face twisted with rage. She told me I was a disgusting, manipulative liar. She accused me of trying to tear apart the family with my bitter jealousy. She said I was trying to destroy the only good thing that had ever happened to her younger daughter. My father DeAndre joined the vicious attack. He slammed his hand on the dining table, rattling the expensive silverware. He demanded that I pack up my things and leave his house immediately. He told me he would not allow me to stand in his living room and defame the man who was going to make this family rich beyond their wildest dreams. They were screaming at me, throwing years of resentment and hatred in my direction, trying to silence the truth with their toxic loyalty to a fraud. I did not flinch. I did not back away or shed a single tear. I stood perfectly still, letting their desperate screams wash over me like a passing storm. I slowly pulled out one of the heavy dining chairs and took a seat right at the head of the table. I leaned back, crossing my legs and folding my hands calmly in my lap. I looked up at my father and my mother, and then I looked directly at Brad, who was sweating profusely under his expensive tailored shirt. "A machine error?" I asked, my voice cutting through their screaming with chilling clarity. "Okay, let us pretend for a moment that it was just a machine error. Then let us talk about the $200,000 bridge loan that Dad and Mom gave you last month. Did the machine make an error with that money too?" The silence that followed my question was so profound that I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock out in the hallway. My mother Brenda stopped breathing entirely, her hand frozen in the air right above the floral centerpiece she had been arranging. My father DeAndre stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute shock and rising fury. The aunts and uncles who had been quietly eating roasted pecans suddenly went completely still, turning their heads to watch the drama unfold. The $200,000 secret that my parents had desperately tried to keep hidden from their financially struggling daughter was suddenly laying bare on the Thanksgiving dinner table for the entire extended family to see. Chloe was the first to break the silence. She let out a piercing shriek that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of the living room. She stomped her designer heels against the hardwood floor, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at me and demanded that I shut my mouth right this instant. She screamed that I had absolutely no right to bring up private financial family business, and that I was intentionally trying to ruin her perfect holiday with my toxic negative energy. She turned to the extended family and loudly declared that I was just making up random numbers because I was desperate for attention. My father, DeAndre, finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. The blood rushed to his face, turning his expression into a thunderous scowl. He took a heavy step toward the dining table and slammed his large fist down onto the polished wood surface. The crystal water glasses rattled violently, and a few drops of water spilled over the rims, staining the crisp white linen tablecloth. He glared at me with a level of hostility I had never seen him direct at anyone else, let alone his own flesh and blood. He raised his voice, ordering me to get up, pack my things, and get out of his house immediately for disrespecting his brilliant son-in-law. He told me I had crossed a line today that could never ever be uncrossed. He said I was an ungrateful, bitter woman who was trying to tear down the only successful man this family had ever known, just because I could not figure out how to keep a man of my own. I did not move a single inch from my chair. I did not flinch at his loud, booming voice or his aggressive posturing. I simply sat there at the head of the table, radiating absolute stillness. I looked directly at my mother, who was nervously twisting a cloth napkin in her hands, avoiding my gaze. I asked her calmly why they thought it was a good idea to take out a second mortgage on their fully paid-off family home to fund a startup company. I reminded them that they had worked their entire lives to pay off this sprawling house, and I asked them why they had gambled away their ultimate security and their retirement funds on a man who could not even afford to buy a single plate of food for their 9-year-old grandson. My mother's face flushed a deep shade of crimson. Her defensive instincts flared up immediately as she rushed to justify her disastrous financial decisions to the room full of staring relatives. She puffed out her chest, attempting to regain her matriarchal authority, and told me that Brad had generously offered them the investment opportunity of a lifetime. She proudly announced to the silent room that Brad had promised them a guaranteed 10 times return on their initial investment as soon as his financial technology company went public. She said they were going to be wealthy millionaires by next summer, and that they would never have to worry about pinching pennies or budgeting ever again. She looked at me with utter disdain and said they were securing generational wealth while I was busy struggling to pay my basic utility bills. My father chimed in, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. He looked down his nose at me and said they had intentionally hidden the investment details from me because I was just too poor and uneducated to understand high-level corporate finance. He said I was nothing more than a low-level accounting clerk who lived paycheck to paycheck, and that my mind was far too small to comprehend the magnificent complexities of venture capital and wealth building. He claimed they were trying to build a massive financial legacy for the family, and that sharing the details with someone as financially illiterate as me would have just caused unnecessary confusion and petty jealousy. They truly believed that Brad was their ultimate white knight, arriving from the tech world to elevate them into the upper echelons of American society. They had eagerly sold out their own daughter to buy favor with a man who viewed them as nothing more than an easy, gullible target. I listened to their pathetic justifications, feeling a profound sense of pity for the two people who had raised me. They were so blinded by their own greed and their desperate need for social validation from a white tech founder that they had willingly walked directly into a financial slaughterhouse. I slowly reached my hand back into my large designer bag. I bypassed the simple restaurant receipt and pulled out a thick, heavy folder filled with dense corporate documents. I dropped the folder onto the dining table right next to the prime cut receipt. It landed with a heavy, solid thud that seemed to make the entire room hold its breath. I looked over at Brad. The arrogant, condescending smirk had completely vanished from his face. He was sweating profusely now, thick beads of perspiration rolling down his temples and soaking into the stiff collar of his expensive tailored shirt. His eyes were locked onto the thick folder, as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike him. He knew exactly what kind of documents were usually kept in folders like that. I reached out and opened the cover of the folder, revealing a heavily redacted financial disclosure document that originated from a highly exclusive venture debt firm. The pages were filled with complex corporate jargon, detailed balance sheets, and forensic accounting reports tracking millions of dollars in missing capital. I did not expect my parents or my sister to understand the technical terms, so I took the liberty of translating the raw data into plain, simple English for them. I looked at my father and told him to sit down, shut his mouth, and listen very carefully to what I was about to say. I told the room that Brad Company was never going to have an initial public offering. I explained that his heavily hyped financial technology startup was an absolute sham from top to bottom. It was a classic Ponzi scheme dressed up in modern Silicon Valley buzzwords to trick unsuspecting investors. I pointed my finger to the highlighted sections of the document and explained step by step how Brad had been taking new investor money, including the $200,000 my parents had literally mortgaged their family home to give him, and shuffling it around to cover his massive existing liabilities. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul, and the music had completely stopped playing. I looked at Chloe, who was clutching her new heavy gold Cartier necklace with trembling hands, her eyes wide with terror. I told her that the shiny new white Mercedes-Benz parked out in the driveway and the expensive gold jewelry she loved to flaunt in my face were not bought with the legitimate profits of a successful business. They were bought with her parents' retirement funds. I revealed that Brad was secretly drowning in a sea of personal gambling debts and that he had been systematically siphoning capital from his naive investors to pay off his dangerous bookies and fund Chloe's luxurious delusional lifestyle. He had stolen the literal roof over my parents' heads just so he could buy expensive toys to make himself look like a successful tech billionaire to his friends. Total chaos erupted in the living room. The air was suddenly thick with raw panic and desperate denial. Chloe began to scream hysterically, shaking her head violently from side to side, refusing to process the reality of her impending poverty. She lunged forward, slamming her hands on the dining table and demanding that I stop telling such horrible, vicious lies about her perfect husband. She refused to believe a single word I was saying. She called me a jealous monster, claiming I had fabricated the entire stack of legal documents just to destroy her perfect marriage out of pure spite. She looked at my parents, begging them not to listen to my toxic fabrications, pleading with them to trust the man who had promised them millions. My mother, Brenda, started hyperventilating, clutching her chest as the horrifying possibility of losing her beautiful suburban home began to slowly penetrate her deep-seated denial. She looked back and forth between the dense financial documents and Brad's pale, sweating face, desperately searching for a reassurance that was not coming. My father stood there completely frozen, his mouth slightly open, staring at the forensic accounting reports with a look of growing absolute terror. The aunts and uncles began whispering loudly to each other, stepping back from Brad as if he were suddenly radioactive. But the most dramatic shift happened with Brad himself. The cornered animal realized his charming white knight facade was no longer protecting him. The polite, magnanimous persona he had carefully crafted over the years completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but pure, vicious malice. He stopped pretending to be the kind, generous brother-in-law who was simply trying to help his struggling wife family. His face contorted into an ugly mask of absolute fury, and his eyes burned with a dark, hateful rage. He wiped the heavy sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand and took a fast, threatening step toward me, his fists clenched tight at his sides. He dropped his voice to a low, menacing growl, showing his true colors for the entire family to see. He called me a delusional ghetto dropout. He used the exact racial and class-based insults he had likely been harboring in his mind for years, finally letting his arrogant bigotry slip out into the open, now that he had nothing left to lose. He told me I was a pathetic nobody, who was trying to play a corporate game in a league I could not possibly understand. He laughed a harsh, cruel laugh that echoed off the living room walls, and said that no one in the real corporate financial world would ever believe a low-level single mother over a prominent white tech founder with Silicon Valley connections. He reached into his expensive trouser pocket and pulled out his sleek smartphone, jabbing his finger aggressively at the screen to unlock it. He told me I had just made the biggest, most catastrophic mistake of my miserable little life. He announced to the silent, horrified room that he was calling his elite legal team at the prestigious law firm of Davis and Lockhart right this very second. He puffed out his chest, trying to regain his dominant posture, and threatened to sue me for every single penny I had ever earned, claiming he would completely destroy my life and my reputation with a massive defamation lawsuit. But he did not stop there. He looked toward the hallway where my sweet, innocent son Jamal was sitting oblivious to the monsters in the other room, and launched his final, most despicable threat. He pointed his phone at me and told me he was going to use his powerful, expensive lawyers to take full legal custody of my child, just to prove to the family courts that I was an unfit, unstable mother. He said he would drag my name through the mud drain, whatever pathetic savings I had in legal fees, and ensure I never saw my son again. He stood there breathing heavily, believing his threats would finally force me to cower and beg for his mercy. He held his smartphone high in the air, making sure every single person in the living room understood the sheer magnitude of the destruction he was preparing to unleash upon me. My mother and father watched him in stunned silence, too paralyzed by the unfolding nightmare to intervene or defend their own daughter. Chloe had stopped screaming and was now watching her husband with a desperate glimmer of hope, believing that his aggressive legal threats would somehow magically erase the crushing reality of the forensic accounting reports lying on the table. Brad glared down at me, his chest heaving, his thumb hovering right over the dial button on his screen. He was waiting for the tears. He was waiting for the panic to set in. He expected me to drop to my knees and apologize for daring to question his absolute authority. I leaned back slowly in the heavy wooden dining chair, crossing my arms over my cashmere sweater. I did not break eye contact with him. The corners of my mouth curled upward into a very small, very cold smile. I tilted my head, gesturing lazily toward the smartphone gripped tightly in his trembling hand. I told him to go ahead and make the call. I told him I was incredibly eager to hear what the elite lawyers at Davis and Lockhart had to say to him today. I watched the confusion flicker across his sweating face as he pressed the call button and put the phone on speaker for the entire room to hear the destruction of my life. The living room felt as though all the breathable oxygen had been violently sucked out of it, leaving behind nothing but a thick, suffocating tension. Brad stood right in the center of the sprawling space, holding his expensive, sleek smartphone out in front of him like it was a weapon of mass destruction. His thumb hovered over the speaker button, and his chest was puffed out with the arrogant certainty of a man who firmly believed his white privilege and his fabricated tech wealth made him entirely invincible. He looked down his nose at me, fully expecting to see raw terror forming in my eyes. He expected me to finally break, to cry, and to beg for mercy under the overwhelming, crushing pressure of his elite legal threats. My mother, Brenda, and my father, DeAndre, stood completely still behind him, holding their collective breath. They were practically vibrating with anticipation, eagerly waiting for the high-powered lawyers at Davis and Lockhart to put their rebellious, ungrateful daughter in her rightful place. They wanted to see me destroyed for daring to question their golden son-in-law. Chloe had stopped clutching her heavy gold Cartier necklace and was now wearing a smug, victorious grin across her face. She leaned casually against the pristine kitchen counter, crossing her arms and waiting for my complete public humiliation. They all genuinely believed that this single phone call was going to be the absolute end of my miserable little life. I simply sat at the head of the heavy wooden dining table, resting my hands calmly in my lap, and waited. I did not blink. I did not look away or show a single ounce of fear. I just gave Brad a slow, icy nod, encouraging him to proceed with his own execution. Brad pressed the speaker icon on his screen, and the loud, rhythmic ringing of the phone echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings of the suburban house. Ring after ring filled the heavy silence of the room. Brad adjusted the stiff collar of his tailored dress shirt, rolling his shoulders back to project ultimate, unquestionable authority to his captive audience. He glanced at my parents, offering them a reassuring, arrogant wink, as if to say he was about to handle taking out the trash for them. The ringing finally stopped, and a crisp, highly professional voice answered the line. It was the receptionist at the prestigious Silicon Valley law firm. Brad cleared his throat, pitching his voice low and commanding, trying to sound like a titan of industry. He told the receptionist that it was Brad Miller, the founder and chief executive officer of Paynova, and that he needed to speak with his senior legal counsel immediately regarding an emergency defamation lawsuit against a hostile family member. The receptionist asked him to hold for a brief moment. Soft classical hold music began to fill my parents' living room, providing a bizarre, calming soundtrack to the impending corporate massacre. Chloe let out a quiet scoff, looking at me with pure, unadulterated disgust. She muttered loud enough for the room to hear that I was going to lose custody of my sweet boy Jamal and end up living on the streets by the time Brad was finished destroying me in court. My father DeAndre nodded in stern agreement, whispering that I had brought this total ruin upon myself by daring to challenge a successful man of Brad's stature. I did not react to their toxic, hateful whispers. I just kept my eyes locked on the glowing screen of the smartphone resting in Brad's trembling hand. The classical music abruptly cut off, and the line connected directly to the senior partner of the firm. But the voice that came through the small speaker was not composed, authoritative, or ready to take legal action on Brad's behalf. The voice sounded breathless, frantic, and deeply panicked. Brad smiled a wide, predatory smile and began to speak, launching into his rehearsed, arrogant speech about how he needed to crush a delusional relative who was spreading vicious lies about his financial technology company. But the elite lawyer did not even let him finish his very first sentence. The lawyer violently cut him off, yelling his name through the speaker with zero professional courtesy. Brad, the lawyer, shouted, his voice echoing sharply and desperately across the quiet living room. "Thank God I finally reached you, because we have a massive, catastrophic problem." Brad's smile instantly froze on his face. His arrogant posture faltered for a fraction of a second, and a look of genuine confusion washed over his features as he asked his attorney what he was talking about. The lawyer did not pause for breath. He launched into a rapid-fire delivery of the most devastating financial news any startup founder could ever possibly hear. He said that he did not care about whatever petty, irrelevant family drama Brad was dealing with right now, because Paynova was officially dead in the water. He told Brad that the venture debt firm holding all of their toxic high-interest loans had suddenly and aggressively sold the entire portfolio in the middle of the night. The lawyer's voice was trembling as he explained that a massive, ruthless private equity firm had swooped in out of nowhere and acquired absolutely every single cent of Brad's outstanding liabilities. Brad's face began to turn a sickly, terrifying shade of gray. He stammered into the phone, his voice cracking, as he asked how a hostile debt acquisition was even legally possible and what it meant for his upcoming, highly anticipated funding rounds. The lawyer practically screamed through the speaker, telling him to wake up because there were no more funding rounds and there never would be again. He told Brad that the new corporate creditors had marched into federal court first thing this morning and filed an aggressive emergency injunction. The federal judge had looked at the forensic accounting showing the blatant illegal mishandling of investor funds and granted the injunction immediately without hesitation. The lawyer rattled off the catastrophic legal consequences with brutal, merciless efficiency. He told Brad that every single corporate bank account tied to Paynova was completely frozen solid. He said that federal marshals were currently standing in the lobby of their Silicon Valley headquarters, seizing the servers, confiscating physical assets, and locking the doors to the public. The company had been thrust directly into hostile receivership. Brad was no longer the chief executive officer of anything. He was locked out of his own building, his own bank accounts, and his own fabric. The lawyer told Brad that the new private equity creditors possessed airtight, undeniable evidence of gross financial misconduct, including the illegal misappropriation of investor funds to cover massive personal gambling debts and luxury lifestyle expenses. Brad started shaking violently, his knees visibly weakening. The expensive smartphone nearly slipped from his sweaty, terrified grip. He begged his lawyer to do something, to file a countermotion to call in a favor with the judge to fix the impossible situation. But the lawyer's response was the final brutal nail in the coffin. The senior partner told Brad that the prestigious firm of Davis and Lockhart did not represent blatant criminals who lied on their federal financial disclosures. He said the law firm was officially dropping Brad as a client, effective immediately to protect their own firm from the incoming federal investigations and the massive fallout. The lawyer told Brad he needed to find a cheap local criminal defense attorney as fast as humanly possible because the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation would absolutely be knocking on his front door before Monday morning. Then the lawyer delivered his final chilling instruction. Do not ever call this number again, Brad. You are completely on your own, and we will deny any ongoing association with your fraudulent operations. There was a sharp click, and the line went totally dead. A loud, hollow dial tone echoed through the silent Thanksgiving living room, replacing the arrogant, loud confidence that had filled the space just moments prior. The dial tone droned on, a mechanical sound of absolute finality. The silence that descended upon the house after the phone call ended was heavy, absolute, and completely suffocating. It was the sound of a total, permanent paradigm shift. All the warm, breathable air had been violently sucked from the room, leaving everyone gasping for a reality that simply no longer existed. The color had drained entirely from Brad's face, leaving him looking like a hollowed-out, transparent ghost. His eyes were wide and vacant, staring deeply at the dark screen of his phone, as if his brain could not physically comprehend the catastrophic words he had just heard. His hand was trembling so severely that he slowly lowered his arm, letting the phone hang limply at his side, defeated and broken. Chloe, who had been leaning against the kitchen counter with that smug, triumphant smirk just 60 seconds ago, looked as if she had been struck by a massive physical blow to the chest. She was holding a delicate crystal wine glass filled to the brim with expensive imported red wine. As her mind struggled desperately to process the terrifying legal and financial terms, the lawyer had just screamed through the speaker. Her fingers simply gave out. The crystal glass slipped from her manicured, trembling hand and plummeted toward the pristine hardwood floor. It hit the ground with a loud, sharp crash, shattering into hundreds of glittering, jagged pieces. The deep, dark red wine splashed violently across the expensive cream-colored rug, looking exactly like blood pooling rapidly around her designer heels. The sound of the shattering glass made my mother Brenda physically jump backwards. She took a stumbling, unsteady step forward, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she clutched the fabric of her decorative holiday apron. She looked back and forth between Brad's paralyzed catatonic form and the dark red stains spreading quickly across the floor. Her eyes grew wide with a creeping, terrifying, and world-ending realization. The fog of her delusion was finally lifting, and the brutal truth was crashing down on her head. She remembered the $200,000 second mortgage they had taken out on this very house to illegally fund the startup company that was now apparently seized by federal marshals. Brad, my mother asked, her voice coming out as a fragile, trembling whisper that broke the agonizing, heavy silence of the room. Brad, what does he mean your assets are frozen? What does he mean hostile receivership and federal investigations? What about the initial public offering you promised us? What about our money, Brad? What about our retirement savings? Brad did not answer her. He could not speak. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but no sound came out. He just stood there, staring blankly ahead, his entire white savior tech bro persona collapsing into a puddle of absolute pathetic ruin. My father. DeAndre suddenly grabbed the edge of a nearby armchair, his chest heaving up and down as he struggled to catch his breath. The invincible golden idol they had worshipped and protected over their own black daughter was crumbling into toxic dust right before their terrified eyes. I sat at the head of the dining table, observing the magnificent total destruction of their lives, with a heart completely devoid of pity or remorse. I had warned them. I had given them a chance to look at the financial documents and understand the truth. Instead, they had chosen to scream at me, humiliate me, defend a racist con artist, and threaten to use expensive lawyers to take my beautiful child away from me. They desperately wanted to see me destroyed and left with nothing. Now they were drowning in the exact deep ocean of ruin they had so happily wished upon me. I slowly placed my hands flat on the polished wood of the dining table and pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the floor, drawing every single terrified, panicked eye in the room directly toward me. I stood up. I did not rush. I moved with the slow, deliberate, calculated grace of an apex predator who had completely cornered its prey and secured the perimeter. I reached down and smoothed out the invisible wrinkles on my cashmere sweater, aligning my posture until I stood perfectly straight and tall. My entire demeanor shifted in that exact glorious moment. The quiet, struggling single mother, who always kept her head down to avoid family conflict, vanished into the ether, never to return. The family scapegoat, the lowly accounting clerk, the woman they thought they could step on and abuse forever, was gone. In her place stood a ruthless, highly calculating, and unbelievably powerful corporate titan. I looked at my mother, who was still shaking violently, and waiting for an answer from the catatonic, fraudulent man standing in the center of her living room. I looked at Chloe, who was staring down at the shattered glass and spilled wine around her feet, as if it represented her entire doomed future of poverty and public humiliation. I looked at my father, who was clutching his chest, and finally beginning to understand the catastrophic magnitude of his financial betrayal and the loss of his family home. And finally, I locked eyes with Brad. He slowly raised his heavy head to meet my gaze, and in his terrified, sunken eyes, I saw the exact moment the horrific realization finally clicked into place in his brain. He remembered the prime-cut steakhouse receipt sitting on the table. He remembered the bold printed name of the corporate billing account, Sterling Crest Capital. He realized exactly who the massive, ruthless private equity firm was. He realized exactly who had aggressively bought up all of his toxic debt in the middle of the night and ordered the federal marshals to raid his office. I took one slow step forward, my designer heels clicking against the floor with absolute undisputed authority. I looked directly at my trembling mother, but I spoke to the entire room, ensuring every single person heard their death sentence. He means, I said, my voice ringing with a cold, dark power that commanded absolute, terrifying submission. He means that the wolf is inside the house. The words hung in the warm air of the dining room, hovering like a thick, toxic cloud that refused to dissipate. No one moved. My father DeAndre simply stared at me, his heavy chest rising and falling as he tried to process the metaphor I had just dropped into the middle of his shattered suburban dream. Chloe was the first to find her voice, though it lacked all the arrogant venom she had possessed just minutes before. She took a shaky step forward, her expensive silk dress rustling in the quiet room, and demanded to know what kind of stupid poetic nonsense I was talking about. She said I was clearly having a mental breakdown because I was too jealous to accept that her husband was a financial genius. She looked at Brad, expecting him to stand up and aggressively put me back in my place, but Brad remained completely paralyzed. He was staring at my face as if he was looking at the devil herself, his mind rapidly connecting the terrifying dots between my name on the restaurant receipt and the massive corporate entity that had just completely liquidated his life. I did not raise my voice to respond to my sister. I walked slowly around the edge of the large dining table, running my fingertips lightly over the polished mahogany wood. I looked directly at my mother, Brenda, who was still clutching her decorative holiday apron, her face a mask of absolute terror. I told them that for the past 8 years they had operated under a very specific, very comfortable delusion. I explained that they had desperately wanted to believe I was a struggling, low-level accounting clerk who barely made enough money to keep the lights on in a small apartment. They believed this because I did not wear flashy designer labels. I did not drive a leased Mercedes-Benz. I did not spend my weekends bragging about phantom wealth to people who did not care about me. They needed me to be a failure, so they could justify placing Chloe on a magnificent golden pedestal simply because she married a white man who spoke in Silicon Valley buzzwords. I stopped pacing and stood perfectly still at the center of the room, commanding the entire space. I looked at my father and told him it was time to finally clear up his profound ignorance regarding my career. I told him I did not work as a basic bookkeeper. I explained that I was a senior partner and the managing director at Sterling Crest Capital. I watched his eyes widen in total disbelief as I slowly spelled out exactly what that meant in the real corporate world. I told him that Sterling Crest Capital was a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm that specialized in the aggressive acquisition and liquidation of distressed corporate assets. I explained that while he was busy spending his retirement savings to buy Brad approval, I was busy managing a global financial portfolio that was quite literally larger than the gross domestic product of several small developing nations. I told him I did not just balance spreadsheets. I bought companies. I dismantled them. I sold their parts for massive profit. I destroyed incompetent executives for a living. My mother shook her head frantically, refusing to let the reality penetrate her thick wall of denial. She stammered out that it was completely impossible. She said I was just a single black mother, and there was absolutely no way the elite corporate finance world would ever hand that level of absolute power to someone like me. She told me I was making up an elaborate, ridiculous lie just to kick Brad while he was down. I smiled a cold, merciless smile and turned my attention back to the sweating, shaking man standing near the kitchen island. I asked Brad to tell my parents if I was lying. I asked him to explain to his adoring in-laws exactly who owned the prime cut steakhouse. Brad swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing nervously in his throat, but he remained entirely silent. So I answered for him. I told my family that 6 months ago my private equity firm had executed a hostile takeover of the entire regional hospitality group that operated the luxury restaurant where they had so happily humiliated me and my 9-year-old son. I explained that when Brad tossed that crumpled $20 bill at my chest and told me to take my black child to a drive-thru, he was actively disrespecting the woman who owned the very chair he was sitting in. I told them I paid the $3,500 dinner bill, not because I cared about saving Brad from public embarrassment, but because paying that specific debt gave me instant direct access to his merchant financial records. It gave me the exact thread I needed to pull to unravel his entire pathetic existence. I watched Chloe's eyes dart wildly back and forth between me and her husband. She begged Brad to say something to tell them I was a psychotic liar, but Brad just slowly sank down into one of the dining chairs, burying his pale face heavily in his trembling hands. His absolute defeat was the most beautiful thing I had ever witnessed. I stepped closer to the table, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. I explained the brutal precision of how the corporate world truly operates to my father, who foolishly thought he was a financial mastermind. I told him that once I saw Brad bouncing multiple consumer credit cards at my restaurant, I immediately had my forensic accounting team tear into the financial architecture of Paynova. I said it took my analysts less than 48 hours to discover the massive gaping holes in his balance sheets. We found the predatory high-interest loans. We found the desperate illegal shuffling of investor capital to cover personal gambling debts. We found the $200,000 bridge loan my parents had foolishly handed over to a man who despised our race, but absolutely loved our money. I leaned forward, placing both of my hands flat on the dining table, leaning my weight toward the shattered tech founder. I told them that I personally orchestrated the complete buyout of his toxic venture debt. I explained that my firm did not just act as an advisor, we were the principal buyers. I told Brad that I did not just pay for his expensive gold-leafed steaks. I told him that as of 9 o'clock yesterday morning, my private equity firm officially owned Paynova. I looked at his shaking shoulders and delivered the final absolute crushing blow. I told him I owned his intellectual property. I owned the massive, expensive lease on his Silicon Valley corporate office. I owned the servers, the source code, and the desk he sat at. And most importantly, I told him I owned the personal financial guarantees attached to his fraudulent debt. I owned him completely and unequivocally. The sheer absolute magnitude of the power dynamic shift hit the room like a physical shockwave. I explained that I was the anonymous creditor who had ordered the elite lawyers at Davis and Lockhart to drop him as a client. I was the one who had instructed the federal marshals to freeze his corporate accounts and lock the doors to his building. I told him that he had spent the last 5 years playing the generous white savior to my naive, gullible parents while secretly using their hard-earned money to fund a criminal Ponzi scheme. He thought he could use his perceived racial and financial superiority to push my son out of the family circle and starve him at a dinner table. He thought there would never be any consequences because he believed a single black mother could never possibly touch him. Chloe suddenly snapped. The fragile, delicate illusion of her wealthy upper-class lifestyle shattered completely, leaving behind nothing but raw, desperate panic. She lunged forward across the dining room, her expensive silk dress catching on the edge of a chair. She pointed her shaking fingers at my face, screaming at the top of her lungs that I was a lying, jealous bitch. She yelled that I had fabricated the entire story because I was deeply unhappy that my own husband had left me, and I wanted to drag her down into the dirt with me. She screamed that Brad was going to sue me for everything I had, and that the federal judges would lock me away in prison for corporate sabotage. She was totally unhinged, her voice cracking and breaking as she desperately tried to claw her way back to the top of a pedestal that had already been vaporized. But her screaming did not change the reality of the room. It only highlighted the pathetic depth of her profound denial. Brad did not jump up to defend her. He did not raise his voice or threaten to call his lawyers again. He simply remained slumped over in the dining chair, his fingers digging fiercely into his hair, his breathing ragged and shallow. He knew it was entirely real. He knew that every single word leaving my mouth was the absolute, undeniable truth. The elite Silicon Valley con artist had been completely outmaneuvered, dismantled, and destroyed by the very woman he had treated like absolute garbage. My father DeAndre watched Brad cowering in the chair, and the final devastating realization crashed down upon his heavy shoulders. The stern, arrogant patriarch who had spent the last decade mocking my career and praising his white son-in-law finally understood the catastrophic mistake he had made. He realized that the $200,000 second mortgage he had secretly taken out on his fully paid-off family home was entirely gone. He realized he had handed his entire life savings and his secure retirement over to a ruthless criminal fraud. And he realized that the only person in the entire world who possessed the wealth, the power, and the direct corporate authority to possibly save him from absolute ruin was the exact same daughter he had just ordered to pack her bags and get out of his house. DeAndre's face contorted in a mask of pure, unfiltered agony. He reached up with a trembling hand and clutched his chest, his fingers digging deeply into the fabric of his shirt as a physical wave of horror washed over his entire body. He stumbled backward away from the dining table, his knees buckling slightly as the crushing weight of his impending poverty and his monumental betrayal settled firmly upon his soul. He had sold out his own flesh and blood, his own beautiful grandson for the illusion of white wealth, and now he was going to lose absolutely everything. He looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading silently, begging for a mercy he absolutely did not deserve. The wolf was indeed inside the house, and I was preparing to devour every single thing they held dear. I watched my father struggling to remain standing, and I felt no urge to reach out and steady him. For years, I had endured his harsh lectures about financial responsibility and the importance of building a legacy. He had constantly paraded Brad around at family barbecues and holiday dinners, pointing to him as the gold standard of what success was supposed to look like. He had allowed Brad to dictate the terms of our family interactions, giving him the best seat at the table, the finest cut of meat, and the loudest voice in the room. My father had willingly participated in the systemic emotional abuse of his own daughter because he was utterly blinded by the shiny veneer of a Silicon Valley startup. Now the shiny veneer had been violently ripped away, exposing the rotting, decaying foundation underneath. My mother Brenda was equally devastated, but her reaction manifested differently. She slowly walked around the shattered crystal and the dark red wine still staining the carpet, her eyes fixed on the thick, heavily redacted financial documents resting on the dining table. She reached out with a trembling hand, hovering her fingers just inches above the paper, as if touching it would somehow make the nightmare permanent. She looked at me, her lower lip quivering, and she asked me in a small, broken voice how I could have possibly done this to my own family. She asked how I could use my immense power to destroy my sister husband and ruin their perfect marriage. I let out a short, dark laugh that lacked any real humor. I told my mother that I did not destroy Brad. I simply bought the debt that he had already accumulated through his own massive incompetence and his insatiable greed. I explained that if I had not acquired the debt, another corporate entity would have done exactly the same thing. The only difference was that another firm would not have known the personal satisfaction of watching him squirm at a Thanksgiving dinner table. I reminded her that Brad was the one who stole her retirement funds to pay off his dangerous bookies. Brad was the one who lied on federal financial disclosures. Brad was the one who starved a 9-year-old boy to stroke his own massive ego. I was simply the executioner delivering the final inevitable blow. I turned my attention back to Chloe, who had stopped screaming and was now sobbing hysterically, leaning against the kitchen counter and sliding down until she hit the floor. She pulled her knees to her chest, her expensive silk dress bunching up around her legs, the heavy gold Cartier necklace looking completely absurd against the backdrop of her total ruin. She looked up at me with mascara running down her cheeks and asked what was going to happen to her. She asked how she was supposed to live without Brad income, without the credit cards, without the luxury lifestyle she had grown so desperately accustomed to. I looked down at my sister, the golden child who had spent her entire life trying to make me feel small and insignificant. I told her that the corporate world did not care about her lifestyle preferences. I explained that when a company goes into hostile receivership due to massive criminal fraud, the creditors do not just stop at the business assets. We go after everything tied to the personal guarantees. I told her that the federal investigators would be looking very closely at every single luxury item she had purchased over the past 3 years. The white Mercedes-Benz sitting in the driveway, the designer handbags in her closet, the expensive jewelry around her neck. It was all bought with stolen investor capital, and it was all subject to immediate seizure and liquidation. The reality of her situation hit Chloe like a freight train. She buried her face in her hands, letting out a loud, agonizing wail that echoed through the quiet house. Brad, still sitting motionless at the table, slowly lifted his head and looked at me with eyes completely dead and devoid of hope. He knew he was facing years in federal prison. He knew his reputation in the tech industry was permanently annihilated. He knew that he had absolutely nothing left to offer the family who had worshipped him. He was a ghost haunting his own life, and I was the one who had written his obituary. My father, DeAndre, still clutching his chest, took a shaky breath and tried to formulate a sentence. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for a lifeline, for a small glimmer of hope in the suffocating darkness. He asked me what we were supposed to do now. He asked how they were going to save the family home, how they were going to survive without the $200,000 they had foolishly given to Brad. He looked at the senior partner of a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm, and he finally recognized my true absolute value. He recognized that the daughter he had cast aside was the only true titan in the room. The execution was complete, and the absolute power I held over their future was undeniable. My father, DeAndre, stood there gasping for air, waiting for me to throw him a lifeline. He expected me to revert to the desperate daughter who always craved his validation. He thought that because I finally had the means to save him, I would automatically step into the role of the dutiful savior. But before I could even open my mouth to respond to his pathetic plea, Chloe suddenly scrambled up from the hardwood floor. The reality of her impending poverty had temporarily short-circuited her brain, but her deep-seated narcissism refused to let her stay down for long. She wiped the smeared black mascara from her cheeks, leaving dark, ugly streaks across her face. She straightened her ruined, expensive silk dress and looked at me with a bizarre, twisted mixture of desperation and furious entitlement. She pointed a shaking finger at me and demanded that I fix the situation immediately. Her voice was shrill and completely devoid of any genuine remorse. She said that since I was the senior partner at this massive private equity firm, I had the absolute power to just make all of Brad's problems completely disappear. She told me to just hit a button on my computer and erase the toxic venture debt. She called his massive multi-million-dollar fraud a simple accounting mistake that got blown out of proportion. She looked at me with wild, frantic eyes and said that as her sister, it was my fundamental duty to protect her marriage and her lifestyle. She actually had the sheer audacity to tell me that I was being incredibly selfish and petty for holding on to a grudge over a single dinner bill at a steakhouse. She demanded that I sign the rights to pay Nova back over to Brad right this second and use my corporate billions to pay off the federal regulators so they could go back to their perfect, wealthy lives. I simply stared at her, marveling at the spectacular depth of her delusion. She was literally standing in a puddle of shattered crystal and spilled wine, begging me to commit federal financial crimes to save a white con artist who had just bankrupted our parents. She did not care about the laws, she did not care about the ethics, and she certainly did not care about the agonizing pain she had inflicted on my son Jamal. She only cared about keeping her shiny white Mercedes-Benz and her country club membership. My mother, Brenda, saw Chloe, frantic demands, and immediately jumped in to support the golden child. The matriarch, who had spent the last 30 years tearing me down, suddenly decided it was time to play the family first card. She walked over to me, her hands clasped tightly together in front of her chest, tears streaming down her face. She tried to reach out and touch my arm, but I took a slow, deliberate step backward, forcing her to keep her distance. She dropped her hands and began to plead with me, using the exact same manipulative tactics she had used my entire life. She told me that God had clearly blessed me with this immense wealth and corporate power for a specific divine reason. She said I was chosen to be the financial savior of the family during their darkest hour. She cried about the sprawling suburban house that she had spent decades decorating, telling me that she and my father were going to be thrown out onto the street if I did not intervene. She said that $200,000 was probably just pocket change to a woman in my position, and that I needed to write them a check today to cover the second mortgage. She looked at Brad, who was still completely catatonic in his chair, and then looked back at me. She told me that Brad was family, and that families must always stick together and protect each other against the outside world. She begged me to forgive him for his minor indiscretions and told me I had a moral obligation to fix this massive disaster because I was finally in a position to give back and prove I was a good, loving daughter. I let her finish her pathetic, manipulative speech. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the absolute hypocrisy of her words to hang heavily in the warm air of the dining room. The smell of the roasted Thanksgiving turkey and the baked macaroni and cheese felt completely sickening against the backdrop of their toxic greed. I looked at my mother and my sister, and I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. The emotional wounds they had inflicted on me over the past 30 years were completely cauterized by the freezing reality of my absolute power. I told my mother that her definition of family was the most twisted, disgusting concept I had ever encountered. I kept my voice perfectly level, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me angry or unhinged. I recounted the 30 years of systematic emotional abuse I had endured under her roof. I reminded her of every single time she had pushed me aside to elevate Chloe. I brought up the times they had mocked my career choices, laughed at my struggles as a single mother, and treated me like a second-class citizen in my own home. I told them that they had spent decades building a hierarchy where I was always at the absolute bottom, existing only to be a convenient scapegoat for their own profound insecurities. Then I turned my attention to the core issue that had brought us to this exact moment of total destruction. I looked directly into my mother-terrified eyes and addressed the unforgivable sin they had committed at the Prime Cut Steakhouse. I told her that she and my father had sat in a luxury private dining room and watched a grown man deliberately deny a 9-year-old child a meal. I told them that they had watched Brad push a basket of cold, complimentary dinner rolls toward my beautiful, innocent boy, while they greedily sliced into gold-leafed wagyu steaks that cost $180 a plate. And instead of protecting their black grandson, they had laughed. They had joined in the cruel humiliation because they were so desperate to secure their proximity to Brad's perceived white wealth. I pointed a steady, firm finger at my father DeAndre, who was leaning heavily against the wall trying to steady his breathing. I told him that he had gambled his entire life savings and the very roof over his head on a man who fundamentally despises our race, but absolutely loves our money. I explained that Brad did not respect them. He did not view them as his equals. He viewed them as naive, gullible targets who were so blinded by their own internalized racism and their desperate need for social validation that they willingly handed over their retirement funds without asking a single intelligent financial question. They had sold out their own flesh and blood simply because Brad was not me. They chose the lying white tech founder over their own hard-working, independent black daughter, and now they were going to pay the ultimate devastating price for that choice. I looked back at Chloe, who was shaking her head and quietly sobbing into her hands. I told her with brutal clinical coldness that I would not be erasing the venture debt. I explained that even if I wanted to commit severe corporate fraud to save her husband, which I absolutely did not, it would not stop the federal government from crushing him. I told her that the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation do not care about sibling rivalries or Thanksgiving dinner apologies. They care about wire fraud Ponzi schemes and the illegal misappropriation of investor capital. I told her that Brad was going to federal prison and she was going to lose every single luxury item she had ever purchased with stolen money. I told my parents that the bank was going to foreclose on their beautiful suburban home and that I would not lift a single finger or write a single check to stop it from happening. They had made their choices, and now the consequences were knocking loudly on the front door. My mother let out a loud, agonizing wail, dropping to her knees on the hardwood floor right next to the shattered crystal and the spilled red wine. She reached out her hands toward me, begging and pleading for a mercy she had never once extended to me or my child. She cried that they were going to be homeless, that they were going to lose everything they had ever worked for. My father buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with the heavy weight of his absolute total ruin. Brad remained perfectly still, staring into the void, completely destroyed by the corporate guillotine I had dropped on his neck. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I felt a profound, beautiful sense of closure. The toxic generational curse that had suffocated me for my entire life was finally permanently broken. I had completely severed the strings they used to manipulate me, and I had done it by dismantling the very foundation of their false reality. I turned my back on my weeping parents and my hysterical sister. I looked toward the front entryway of the house, where the heavy oak front door stood closed. I reached into my designer purse and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped a single button, sending a silent, prearranged signal to the custom Maybach parked out on the street. I stood perfectly still, waiting for the final piece of my orchestrated execution to fall into place. Less than 30 seconds later, the heavy brass doorknob turned and the front door swung open. The loud creak of the hinges made my family freeze their sobbing, cutting off abruptly as they looked toward the foyer in terrified confusion. Stepping over the threshold and into the warm light of the hallway was my personal driver, Tyrone. He was a towering, incredibly broad-shouldered ex-military man who moved with silent, lethal efficiency. He was dressed in a pristine, tailored black suit, his posture radiating absolute, unquestionable authority. His presence alone seemed to command the very air in the room, making my father shrink back even further against the living room wall. Tyrone did not speak. He did not acknowledge the crying women on the floor or the shattered tech founder sitting at the dining table. He simply walked directly toward me, his heavy footsteps thudding with quiet power against the floorboards. He stopped a few feet away, giving me a respectful nod. In his large right hand, he was holding a simple brown paper grocery bag. The bag was slightly crumpled, and the top was rolled down exactly the way someone would pack a cheap lunch for a long day of hard labor. My family stared at the brown paper bag with wide, desperate eyes. In their deeply ingrained greed and their delusional desperation, they genuinely thought it was a lifeline. Chloe stopped crying, her eyes darting toward the bag, hoping against all logic that it was filled with stacks of $100 bills meant to bail them out of their misery. My mother. Brenda held her breath, praying that her wealthy corporate titan daughter had brought them a massive bundle of cash to pay off the second mortgage and save the family home. They still fundamentally believed that because we shared the same blood, I would eventually capitulate and save them from the horrific consequences of their own actions. I reached out and took the brown paper bag from Tyrone. I held it in my hands, feeling the light, insignificant weight of the contents inside. I looked at my family, letting them marinate in their pathetic, desperate hope for just a few more seconds. I enjoyed watching them stare at the crumpled paper bag like a pack of starving animals waiting to be fed by the very person they had spent 3 decades trying to destroy. It was the ultimate beautiful poetry of the moment. I held their entire future in my hands, and they knew it. I looked at my mother, my father and my sister, and I prepared to deliver the final spectacular finishing blow to their toxic, abusive empire. I slowly turned away from my weeping mother and my ruined sister and walked toward the center of the massive dining room table. The table was a masterpiece of suburban financial excess funded entirely by stolen money. There was a massive golden roasted turkey sitting right in the center, surrounded by expensive crystal bowls filled with glazed sweet potatoes, candied yams, and rich green bean casserole. The fine, polished silver cutlery gleamed under the warm light of the crystal chandelier overhead. It was an elaborate feast designed to celebrate their fake wealth and their proximity to a white con artist who had just bankrupted them. I stopped right in front of the perfectly roasted turkey. I looked down at the lavish spread, and then I looked back at my father, DeAndre, making sure we had direct, unwavering eye contact. I raised the crumpled brown paper bag high over the center of the table. I grabbed the bottom corners of the bag and tipped it completely upside down. The pathetic hope in my parents' eyes instantly vanished as the contents of the bag spilled out and crashed down right on top of their beautiful Thanksgiving feast. 4 cheap squished ham and cheese sandwiches wrapped in thin, crinkling plastic wrap tumbled out of the bag and bounced off the golden skin of the roasted turkey. A loaf of stale generic white bread in a cheap plastic bag fell heavily onto a crystal dish of cranberry sauce, sending dark red splashes across the pristine white linen tablecloth. A few bruised yellow apples rolled across the polished wood table, knocking over a tall crystal wine glass and spilling water everywhere. The visual contrast between the luxurious holiday spread and the depressing poverty food was absolutely striking. It was a jarring, deeply insulting display that completely shattered the elegant aesthetic my mother had worked so hard to create to impress her fake friends and her thieving son-in-law. My mother let out a small, horrified gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands as she stared at the generic loaf of bread resting in her cranberry sauce. My father stared at the squished, plastic-wrapped sandwiches resting on top of his prized turkey, his brain struggling to comprehend the profound, calculated insult of the gesture. I smoothed out the empty brown paper bag, folded it neatly, and placed it right next to the stale loaf of bread. I looked directly at my father and kept my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any sympathy or familial warmth. I told him that since he and my mother were officially bankrupt and facing imminent foreclosure by the end of the month, they were going to need to learn how to aggressively budget their meals. I reminded him of the exact cruel, unforgivable words he had spoken to me at the Prime Cut Steakhouse just 1 week prior. I told him that he was the man who looked me in the eye and said, I should have packed a cheap lunchable for my 9-year-old son when Brad intentionally starved him at a luxury dining table. I told my father that I took his brilliant financial advice to heart and brought exactly what he asked for. I said that since Brad had just completely wiped out their entire retirement savings and gambled away their second mortgage, wagyu steak and expensive catered holiday dinners were permanently off the menu for this family. I pointed a manicured finger to the cheap squished ham sandwiches and the stale bread resting on the table. I told them they needed to get used to eating like that because it was absolutely all they could afford from now on. I made it crystal clear that I would not be opening my wallet to save the people who had watched my child sit with an empty plate. The absolute brutal irony of the moment crashed down upon them with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. My father, DeAndre, staggered backward, as if he had been physically struck in the chest with a baseball bat. The color completely drained from his face, and a loud, agonizing sob tore its way out of his throat. The proud, arrogant patriarch, who had spent his entire life valuing financial status over his own black daughter, was now weeping openly and uncontrollably in his ruined dining room. He realized in that exact moment that he had backed the wrong child. He had sold his soul and his legacy to a white tech bro who despised him, and in doing so, he had alienated the only daughter who actually possessed the power and the wealth to change his life. He sank down into a nearby chair, burying his face in his large hands as he mourned the total permanent loss of his dignity, his retirement, and his home. Chloe completely lost whatever tiny shred of sanity she had left. She threw her head back and began sobbing hysterically, pounding her fists against the hardwood floor among the shattered glass. The golden child who had built her entire fragile identity around designer labels and unearned superiority was now reduced to a pathetic, wailing mess. She wailed that it was not fair that her life was over, that she could not survive being poor, and that she did not know how to live without a luxury car. Brad remained entirely catatonic in his seat. He did not move a single muscle to comfort his weeping wife. His eyes were glazed over, staring blankly at the squished ham sandwiches on the table. The elite Silicon Valley founder was nothing more than an empty, hollow shell. A fraud who knew his next permanent destination was a federal prison cell. He was entirely broken, dismantled down to his very core by the black woman he had tried to humiliate for existing in his presence. The extended family members, the aunts and uncles who had happily eaten my parents' food and nodded along with their toxic behavior for decades, were completely silent. They stood perfectly still, holding their breath, terrified to make a single sound, terrified that if they drew my attention, I might turn my corporate guillotine toward them next. They looked at me with deep, profound fear, mixed with an undeniable respect. They finally understood that the quiet single mother they had always looked down upon was an untouchable force of nature who could destroy lives with a single phone call. I did not waste another second looking at the pathetic wreckage of my biological family. I turned my back on the weeping adults and the ruined Thanksgiving feast and walked toward the den at the back of the house. I opened the door and stepped into the dim room. My son Jamal was sitting quietly on the comfortable sofa, his tablet resting securely in his lap. He had his noise-canceling headphones on, mercifully insulated from the screaming, the crying, and the complete financial devastation that had consumed the living room. I walked over to him and gently touched his shoulder. He took off his headphones and looked up at me, his big brown eyes filled with innocent curiosity and endless trust. I smiled down at him, a warm, genuine smile that I reserved only for the people who truly deserved my love and my protection. I told him it was time for us to go home. Jamal slid off the sofa and took my hand, his small fingers wrapping securely around mine. As we walked out of the den and back into the main hallway, he paused for a brief moment, taking in the bizarre, chaotic scene unfolding in the dining room. He saw his grandfather crying deeply in a chair, hiding his face in shame. He saw his Aunt Chloe sobbing hysterically on the floor, clutching her gold necklace. He saw the stale, generic bread resting right on top of the holiday turkey. He looked up at me, his brow furrowed in mild confusion, and asked me if we were leaving the party early. I squeezed his hand reassuringly and kept my voice soft and sweet. "Yes, baby." I told him, "We are leaving right now because the air in this house is incredibly toxic, and we only breathe the finest air." Jamal simply nodded, accepting my answer without any further questions or complaints. He trusted me completely, and I knew I would spend the rest of my life ensuring that his beautiful trust was always validated and protected. We walked straight through the foyer, stepping past the weeping enablers and the shattered frauds without giving them a second glance. Tyrone, my faithful driver, stepped forward and pulled the heavy wooden front door wide open for us. The crisp, cool November evening air rushed into the stifling house, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and absolute freedom. I stepped out onto the front porch, my head held high, my spine perfectly straight, leading my son away from the generational trauma that had tried to drown us both for far too long. We walked down the long concrete driveway past Chloe parked white Mercedes-Benz that would inevitably be repossessed by the bank within a matter of days. Waiting for us at the curb was my sleek, immaculate black chauffeured Maybach. The polished exterior gleamed brilliantly under the streetlights, a quiet, undeniable testament to the massive empire I had built with my own two hands while they were busy underestimating me. Tyrone opened the heavy rear door for us, and I helped Jamal climb into the incredibly plush leather interior. I slid in right next to him, the rich, calming smell of luxury leather wrapping around us like a protective physical shield. Tyrone closed the door with a solid, comforting thud, sealing us away from the suburban nightmare forever. The Maybach engine purred to life, silent and incredibly powerful. As the car smoothly pulled away from the curb, leaving the house of lies, shrinking rapidly in the rearview mirror, I felt an overwhelming, beautiful sense of peace settle over my entire body. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried for 34 years was completely gone, washed away by the tide of absolute justice. I had survived their cruelty. I had built my own kingdom, and I had returned only long enough to burn their toxic hierarchy straight to the ground. I settled back into the heated massage seat, pulling a soft cashmere blanket over Jamal's lap as he happily went back to playing video games on his tablet. The soft ambient lighting inside the luxury vehicle created a perfect safe haven for the two of us moving through the quiet streets of Atlanta. I reached into my designer purse and pulled out my smartphone, intending to silence it for the rest of the evening, so I could simply enjoy the ride home. But as the screen illuminated, a high-priority encrypted email notification popped up on my secure corporate dashboard. The sender was my lead compliance attorney at Sterling Crest Capital, working in direct tandem with federal regulators. I tapped the screen and read the brief, highly confidential message that would serve as the final nail in Brad's coffin. The text confirmed that the Securities and Exchange Commission had just officially greenlit the federal investigation into Brad Miller and Pinova, based entirely on the massive trove of forensic accounting evidence my firm had provided to them earlier that afternoon. Criminal wire fraud charges were actively pending, and federal arrest warrants were currently being drafted by the Department of Justice. His passport was flagged, and his complete loss of freedom was guaranteed. I locked the screen of my phone and slipped it back into my bag, safely tucking away the instrument of their total destruction. I looked out the tinted passenger window, watching the dark trees and neighborhood streetlights blur past us as we glided smoothly toward the heart of the city where we belonged. The revenge was absolute, the execution was completely flawless, and the justice was incredibly sweet. I leaned over and kissed the top of my sun head, knowing with absolute certainty that our future was infinitely brighter than the pathetic ruined past we had just left behind in the dirt. The next few weeks unfolded exactly like a perfectly orchestrated symphony of destruction. I did not have to lift another finger to ruin them, because I had already set the massive heavy wheels of justice into perpetual motion. I spent my mornings sipping expensive imported coffee on the balcony of my penthouse, watching the sun rise over the city skyline, while my biological family experienced the absolute total collapse of their fabricated reality. I watched their downfall with a calm, clinical detachment, viewing the entire spectacle through the cold, objective lens of a corporate auditor reviewing a bankruptcy filing. There was no lingering anger or residual sorrow left in my body. I was simply an observer watching the inevitable physical manifestation of karma, arriving to collect its long overdue debts. The first domino to fall was Brad. The execution of his fraudulent tech empire was swift, brutal, and highly publicized. It happened on a crisp Tuesday morning, just 4 days after the Thanksgiving dinner massacre. The federal agents did not afford him the luxury of a quiet, discreet surrender. The Securities and Exchange Commission, working in tandem with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, orchestrated a massive coordinated raid on the Silicon Valley headquarters of Pinova. I read the detailed reports from my compliance team, describing how dozens of armed federal agents in dark windbreakers swarmed the glass and steel building. They locked down the entire perimeter, seizing every single corporate server, every laptop, and every shredded document they could find in the massive recycling bins. Brad was sitting in what used to be his corner office, desperately trying to shred offshore bank statements when the agents breached his heavy wooden doors. The arrogant white tech founder, who had thrown a $20 bill at me in a luxury steakhouse, was physically pinned against his expensive mahogany desk and placed in heavy steel handcuffs. They marched him straight through the center of his own bustling lobby, forcing him to do a humiliating perp walk in front of his entire terrified staff and the flashing cameras of the local news stations that had been tipped off about the raid. He was officially charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and the illegal misappropriation of millions of dollars in venture capital. His face was plastered across every major financial news network, completely destroying his reputation and guaranteeing that he would never work in the corporate sector ever again. He was denied bail due to being a significant flight risk, and he was sent directly to a federal holding facility to await a trial that would undoubtedly end with a lengthy prison sentence. Chloe experienced her own spectacular downfall mere hours after her husband was dragged away in handcuffs. She had desperately tried to maintain her fragile illusion of wealth, ignoring the catastrophic warnings I had given her in our parents' dining room. She actually had the sheer delusional audacity to drive her gleaming white Mercedes-Benz to her exclusive country club that afternoon, hoping to gossip with her fake wealthy friends and pretend that her life was not actively burning to the ground. She was sitting on the outdoor patio of the clubhouse, sipping a highly expensive cocktail and wearing her heavy gold Cartier necklace when the consequences of her greed finally caught up to her. I received the repo order confirmation directly from my asset management team. A heavy-duty industrial tow truck pulled right past the manicured front gates of the elite country club and drove straight up to the valet parking loop. The driver did not ask for permission. He simply backed up to Chloe's pristine luxury vehicle, hooked the heavy steel chains under the front axle, and hoisted the expensive car into the air. Chloe heard the commotion from the patio and ran outside her designer heels, clicking frantically on the pavement. She began screaming at the top of her lungs, waving her manicured hands, and demanding that the tow truck driver drop her car immediately. She yelled that she was a prominent member of the club and threatened to have him arrested for grand theft auto. The tow truck driver remained completely unimpressed by her hysterical screaming. He calmly handed her a stack of legal documents detailing the total default on the vehicle loan and the immediate corporate seizure of the asset. Chloe was forced to stand there in the middle of the crowded circular driveway, completely humiliated, as all the wealthy women she had spent years trying to impress watched her car get dragged away like cheap garbage. The pristine facade she had built her entire identity around shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces in front of her entire social circle. She was left stranded at the country club with no transportation, no money, and absolutely no dignity. Without Brad's stolen income to pay the massive monthly rent on their luxury townhouse, Chloe was officially evicted before the end of the month. The golden child who had mocked my son for eating cold bread was violently forced to pack her designer clothes into cheap cardboard boxes and move into a tiny rundown studio apartment in a terrible neighborhood on the extreme outskirts of the city. My parents, DeAndre and Brenda, faced a ruin that was quieter but infinitely more devastating. Their tragedy was not broadcast on the local evening news, but it destroyed the very foundation of their entire lives. The $200,000 second mortgage they had foolishly taken out to fund Brad's criminal Ponzi scheme became an immediate toxic liability. Without the promised return on their investment, and without Brad to bail them out, they completely defaulted on the massive monthly payments. The bank holding the mortgage did not care about their long history of home ownership or their tears of regret. The foreclosure process was initiated with ruthless robotic efficiency. I drove past their sprawling suburban neighborhood one afternoon, keeping my distance in the tinted safety of my chauffeured car. I watched from afar as the large wooden foreclosure sign was hammered violently into their perfectly manicured front lawn. The house that had served as the ultimate symbol of their middle-class success. The house where they had constantly belittled my career and praised Chloe. Superficial Achievements was officially repossessed by the bank. They had to host an embarrassing estate sale on their front driveway, selling off their expensive leather furniture, their crystal dining sets, and the large flat-screen television they loved to watch. They sold the pieces of their fabricated, wealthy lifestyle for mere pennies on the dollar, just to afford the basic moving costs. They had gambled their entire generational security on a man who despised them, and they had lost absolutely everything they had spent 40 years working to build. The total isolation of their new reality quickly began to suffocate them. The aunts and uncles who had happily eaten their catered holiday dinners and nodded along with their toxic behavior completely abandoned them when the money dried up. The extended family distanced themselves from the massive, embarrassing scandal surrounding Brad's federal wire fraud charges. My parents were left completely alone, living in a cheap, cramped rental apartment surrounded by cardboard boxes and the crushing heavy weight of their monumental betrayal. They finally realized the catastrophic magnitude of what they had done. They realized that they had sacrificed their only truly successful child at the altar of white corporate greed, and now they were paying the ultimate devastating price. Their desperate panic manifested in a relentless barrage of phone calls and voicemails. My secure private mobile phone, which I had not yet bothered to change, simply so I could monitor the spectacular depth of their suffering, lit up constantly with incoming notifications. They blew up my phone day and night, leaving dozens of long weeping voice messages begging for my mercy. I sat in my massive corner office at Sterling Crest Capital, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offered a commanding panoramic view of the bustling city below. The office was a sanctuary of absolute power and quiet luxury. The heavy mahogany desk, the soft leather seating, the priceless modern art on the walls. All of it was a testament to the empire I had built with my own two hands. I poured myself a cup of dark, rich coffee, tapped the screen of my smartphone, and pressed play on the folder full of accumulated voicemails. I listened to them sequentially, letting the desperate sounds of my ruined family wash over me while I reviewed global market acquisition reports. The first few voicemails were from my mother, Brenda. Her voice was high-pitched and thick with hysterical sobbing. She begged me to pick up the phone, crying that she and my father were living out of suitcases in a terrible neighborhood where she was afraid to go outside after dark. She pleaded with me to let them come stay in the spare guest room of my luxury penthouse. She promised that things would be different now that she finally understood how terrible Brad truly was. She told me I was her beautiful, smart daughter, and that she was so incredibly proud of the massive company I had built. She used every single manipulative tactic she had perfected over the past 3 decades, trying to guilt me into becoming their financial savior. She cried that they were old and frail, and that family was supposed to forgive each other when times got tough. The next set of voicemails were from my father, DeAndre. His messages lacked the hysterical crying of my mother, but they were heavy with a deep, pathetic kind of brokenness. The arrogant, booming patriarch voice was completely gone, replaced by the weak, trembling tone of a man who had lost his entire identity. He apologized over and over again for the things he had said to me at the Thanksgiving dinner. He begged me to help them secure a small loan to buy a modest house so they would not have to live in a miserable tiny apartment for the rest of their lives. He told me he was so sorry for letting Brad treat my son Jamal so poorly at the steakhouse. He said he would do anything to make it right if I would just answer the phone and give him one more chance to be a good father. Chloe left messages too, but hers were entirely unhinged. She vacillated wildly between aggressive screaming and pathetic begging. In one voicemail, she threatened to tell the media that I had orchestrated the entire destruction of her husband's tech company, illegally, just to ruin her life. In the very next voicemail, she was crying so hard she could barely breathe, begging me to wire her $10,000 so she could afford to pay a criminal defense attorney for Brad. She pleaded with me to remember that we were sisters, and that I could not possibly be cruel enough to let her starve in a disgusting bug-infested studio apartment. She said her life was completely over, and that it was entirely my fault for being so incredibly ruthless. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair, sipping my coffee and staring out at the beautiful bright city skyline. The voicemails played one after another, a tragic symphony of consequences that they had entirely brought upon themselves. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt listening to their desperate pleading. I felt nothing but cold, hard validation. They were not sorry for the 30 years of emotional abuse they had inflicted upon me. They were not truly sorry for the racist, degrading way they had allowed my son to be treated. They were only sorry that they had bet their money on the wrong horse and ended up living in poverty. They were crying because they were suffering the exact same fear and instability they had happily wished upon me when they thought I was just a struggling low-level accounting clerk. The audio messages finally ended, leaving my expansive corner office in total, blissful silence. I set my coffee cup down on the polished mahogany desk and opened my secure banking application on my computer monitor. The revenge I had executed was perfectly flawless, but I knew that true absolute power did not just come from destruction. True power came from total ultimate control. I had watched them burn their own lives to the ground, but I was not entirely heartless. I was, however, strictly undeniably just. I looked at the massive balance in my personal offshore accounts. I thought about my parents sleeping on a cheap mattress in a dangerous, run-down apartment complex, terrified of their own future. I knew they deserved every single second of their misery, but I also knew that leaving them to completely rot on the street would make me just as cruel and ugly as they were. I decided to make one final definitive financial move. It would be a move that proved I was infinitely better than they could ever hope to be, but it would also serve as a permanent, inescapable reminder of their total submission to the daughter they had thrown away. I began typing rapidly on my keyboard, navigating through a series of anonymous shell companies and blind corporate trusts that my firm utilized for discreet asset management. I was preparing to sever the toxic ties completely, but I was going to do it in a way that guaranteed they would never ever be able to look me in the eye again. I was going to teach them the final agonizing lesson about what happens when you underestimate the quiet woman sitting at the end of the table. I sat in the quiet solitude of my massive corner office and finalized the legal paperwork on my computer screen. I used a highly secured network of offshore shell companies and an anonymous blind trust that my firm utilized for private philanthropic ventures. I directed my asset management team to purchase a very modest, highly functional one-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood on the far south side of Atlanta. It was not a dangerous area, but it was incredibly humbling. There were no granite countertops, no stainless steel appliances, and absolutely no country club amenities. It was a basic brick building with cheap linoleum floors and a shared laundry room down in the basement. I instructed my legal team to contact my parents through a third-party mediation service. The lawyers would inform DeAndre and Brenda that a local charitable relief fund for victims of financial fraud had stepped in to cover their basic housing and utility costs for the remainder of their natural lives. They would be given the keys to the tiny apartment and a strict set of rules they had to follow to maintain the housing assistance. They would never know that the anonymous benefactor paying for their survival was the exact same daughter they had thrown out of their house. They would spend the rest of their lives thanking a faceless charity, completely unaware that they were existing entirely on my quiet mercy. It was the ultimate checkmate. I kept my conscience completely clean by ensuring the people who gave me life would not freeze to death on the streets. But I also ensured they would never again experience a single ounce of unearned luxury. They had absolutely zero leverage over me, and they would never be given the opportunity to look me in the eye and pretend to be grateful. Once the real estate transaction was fully funded and the legal contracts were digitally signed, I closed my laptop. I picked up my smartphone and opened the voicemail application. I selected the entire folder of weeping, desperate messages from my mother, my father, and my sister, and I permanently deleted all of them. I watched the audio files vanish from the screen, erasing their toxic voices from my life forever. I then called my personal telecommunications provider and ordered a complete immediate replacement of both my personal cell phone number and Jamal mobile device number. I had my cybersecurity team scrub our personal contact information from all public databases and data broker websites. Within 30 minutes, every single digital bridge connecting me to my biological family was totally incinerated. If they ever tried to call my old number again, they would only hear a disconnected mechanical tone. The toxic generational cycle that had plagued our family for decades was finally permanently broken. I sat back in my chair and took a deep breath of the crisp, filtered air circulating through my office. I looked out through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, watching the tiny cars moving through the busy streets of Atlanta far below me. I reflected on the true nature of family and loyalty. I realized that sharing blood with someone does not automatically grant them endless access to your energy, your wealth, or your spirit. Loyalty is earned through mutual respect and unwavering protection. They had chosen to protect a fraudulent, arrogant man simply because he fit their deeply flawed, internalized image of success. And they had paid the ultimate devastating price for their profound ignorance. I had learned that protecting your peace of mind and preserving the emotional safety of your child is the absolute highest form of wealth a woman can ever possess. My empire was secure, my son was safe, and my soul was completely untethered from their heavy, suffocating anchor. The transition into our new peaceful reality was beautiful. Flash forward to a cool, crisp Friday night in downtown Atlanta. Jamal and I were walking through the heavy mahogany doors of the Prime Cut Steakhouse. The atmosphere in the luxury restaurant was warm and inviting, filled with the soft ambient sounds of clinking crystal and quiet, sophisticated conversations. We did not have to wait in the crowded lobby. Mr. DuPont, the general manager, was waiting for us at the front podium, standing with perfectly straight posture and a deeply respectful smile on his face. He greeted me warmly and spoke to Jamal with the utmost reverence before personally escorting us back to the exclusive private VIP dining room. It was the exact same room where my family had attempted to humiliate us just a few short weeks ago. But tonight the room felt entirely different. There was no toxic energy, no loud, obnoxious bragging, and no cruel, mocking laughter. It was just me and my beautiful, intelligent boy sitting together at the massive, polished wood table. Mr. DuPont did not send a regular waiter to serve us. He personally wheeled a silver serving cart into the private dining room. Resting in the center of the cart was a massive, immaculate porcelain plate covered by a gleaming silver dome. Mr. DuPont lifted the dome with a dramatic flourish, revealing the absolute largest, most perfectly seared cut of gold-leafed wagyu steak the restaurant had ever produced. The rich, incredible aroma filled the room as he carefully placed the spectacular meal directly in front of Jamal, along with a generous portion of creamy garlic mashed potatoes and grilled asparagus. Jamal's eyes grew wide with pure joy as he looked at the magnificent feast. He picked up his heavy silver fork and knife and cut a tender piece of the expensive meat. He took a slow, deliberate bite, closing his eyes as the incredible flavors melted in his mouth. He chewed, happily swallowed, and then looked across the table at me with a bright, radiant smile illuminating his young face. "This is way better than bread, Mom," he said, his voice filled with sweet, innocent satisfaction. I reached for my tall crystal flute filled with crisp, bubbling, sparkling cider. I held it up across the table, waiting for him to raise his own glass of cider. Our glasses met in the middle of the table with a soft, beautiful clinking sound that echoed perfectly in the quiet, luxurious room. "Only the best for you, kid," I said, returning his warm, brilliant smile. "Only the best." The warm, ambient lighting of the chandelier above us seemed to glow even brighter as we enjoyed our peaceful, well-deserved dinner, wrapping us in a quiet, beautiful safety as the scene finally faded to black. A lesson learned from this story is that true wealth is never loud or flashy. It lies in the quiet power of knowing your own worth and maintaining your composure when toxic family members try to humiliate you. Sharing blood does not give anyone the right to disrespect your children or abuse your kindness. Setting strict boundaries and walking away from manipulative relatives is the most empowering decision you can ever make. If you find yourself sitting at a table where your presence is not valued, do not be afraid to stand up and leave. Please like and subscribe today.